Something interesting happened, or more precisely, did not happen, during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Whenever conflicts arise in the Middle East, everyone's concerns immediately go to oil, as disruption to exports from the region appear to threaten markets globally. And yet, even with the United States joining the bombing campaign, the markets barely seem to blink this time. That raises the critical question of why, and whether this was a unique case, or if oil has more generally lost its status as a weapon of economic war. Moreover, the answers can inform us about how the counter-coalition of Russia, China, and Iran currently operates. To get a better sense of these issues, I spoke to Cullen Hendrix, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a non-partisan think tank dedicated to promoting peace through economic integration. Cullen is an expert on natural resources and conflict. Prior to joining Peterson, he was a professor at the University of Denver for 9 years. And if you listen to the end of our interview, you will learn that we go back a long way. Cullen recently wrote an explainer about why the oil markets did not really move following the bombing of Iran. It caught my eye, and so I asked him to join me to go into further depth. I began by asking him about where things stood before the latest round of hostilities. In broad strokes, why don't you tell me about all of the trepidation in the oil markets before the start of the 12-day war?
Sure. So if we think about what the world was like just a few weeks ago, we were in a context where any kind of disruption to oil markets or any kind of political instability in an oil exporting country historically probably would have been reflected very quickly in a price spike. What do I mean by that kind of world? Well, we were in a world that was characterized by broad Western sanctions on Russian oil exports, the highest kind of level of economic policy uncertainty at the global level that we've ever seen, or at least since this became kind of formally tracked beginning in the 1980s, and the most active armed conflicts across the globe since the end of the Cold War. Given all of that, and then given the ongoing uncertainty about the economic policies and the foreign policy more generally of the Trump administration, I would say that under normal circumstances or historically normal circumstances, this would be a time at which markets would be really on edge.
Well, that ties into what I wanted to ask you about next, which is the broad history of U.S. strategic thinking about such a strike. One of the arguments in the United States against such a strike, especially against the Iranian nuclear facilities, and this goes back more than a decade at this point, was that there would be a big oil shock. And given that you just described an environment where it seemed like we were especially primed for an especially large oil shock, then it's all the more surprising that what was supposed to happen didn't happen. But before we get to what didn't actually happen, why don't you tell me a little bit more about what was supposed to happen, the expectations about a complete oil disaster should there be a conflict between the United States and Iran?
Basically, since beginning in 1973 in earnest, some people might date it to say the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, but really beginning in the 1970s in earnest, if you were to have a strike by a major Western power on a Middle Eastern oil exporting country, markets would have reacted rapidly and negatively in the sense that it would have sent prices skyrocketing. And that's because by the 1970s, the Middle East, along with the Soviet Union and Africa, were responsible for essentially 100% of the world's exportable oil. That is the exportable surplus that went beyond what any particular country or region consumed themselves. And so if you were going to have a major kind of destabilizing sort of event occurring in the Middle East, the market expectation would have been that prices would have gone through the roof. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, some of the early news reports were suggesting that some analysts expected oil to go as high as $150 a barrel, which would have been some of the highest prices we'd seen in well over a decade.
But as I'm showing on the screen now, there is a significant difference or change over time about where the oil is actually coming from in the world. So why don't you explain what's going on there?
I started thinking about this in the context of exactly these types of discussions. So why is it that beginning, say, in the 2010s, this relationship between kind of Middle East political instability and an oil risk premium had kind of evaporated? And really the story, I think, has kind of three components to it, but the most important is just that the geography of global oil production, and in particular oil exports, has changed pretty significantly. And that begins in the 21st century in the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada, with the shale revolution, right? This technological breakthrough that allows the United States, which had become very oil import dependent, to, in the space of less than 2 decades, going from being deeply oil import dependent to being one of the larger exporters of oil now in the world. At the same time that was happening in North America, you also had this market reaction to the high commodity prices that we had in the aughts and then in the early 2010s, which catalyzed a lot of exploration effort. And one of the big upshots of that was the discovery of significant offshore deposits in Latin America, in particular offshore deposits in Guyana and offshore deposits in Brazil, which have come online as well. And they're also adding to this kind of exportable cushion of oil that is coming from the Western Hemisphere, which, by comparative standards, is considered geopolitically safe. Certainly, geopolitically safe relative to, say, the Middle East under current circumstances, or Russia under same.
Well, I think what you just described is going to answer in part the question that I want to get at now. But to rewind a moment, can you walk me through what actually happened to the oil markets in response to the strikes against Iran?
Okay, so there was a reaction by markets to the strikes on Iran, but actually the market really reacted to the earlier strikes that had been conducted by Israel. So the June 13th strikes, which caused oil prices, for crude benchmarks to increase by somewhere between 7 and 8% on June 13th. Now, when you fast forward to the U.S. strikes, the trading was not occurring on the day after the U.S. strikes in the United States because it was on Sunday. But by the time markets reopened again on Monday, oil was actually closed down a little bit from where it had been as recently as, I think, June 18th or June 20th. And then by Friday, June 27th, oil was back trading at about $65 per barrel. So to kind of put a bow on that, right, you have this kind of doomsday scenario that geopolitical analysts and oil market watchers had been anticipating, which would be a major Western strike on Iran's nuclear facilities that was anticipated to send oil prices skyrocketing, and the markets effectively shrugged. I mean, it really is a puzzle if you're operating within kind of the conventional mindset, which is that any instability in the Middle East is going to send a really quick signal into these commodity markets and oil in particular.
Okay, well, tying the last 2 points together, one, a change in what the global oil market looks like, and 2, what we observed with the actual reaction on the markets. And I know that there's other reasons why you think the markets behaved in this particular way that we will get to later on. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there is a disconnect between what the analyst community was expecting to happen and what the markets actually think. And perhaps that is a disconnect that has existed previously, but it's only right now that we're observing that in practice.
Yeah, I mean, so there's been some interesting research on this that's been done by economists at the IMF, and what they would point to is that the market responses to Middle East instability essentially become much more muted beginning in the 2010s. Around, some people would date it to say 2011, some people would date it to say 2014. But the point is that markets for about a decade now have reacted very differently to any instance of political instability in the Middle East than they would have in previous decades. Analysts, however, I think are still operating under the assumption, and for decades it was the correct assumption to make, that instability in the Middle East, in particular instability involving a major global oil exporter, would translate into higher prices. And so this disconnect is very interesting to me for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that, market the ways that markets react are a combination of kind of the actual market signals and changes in anticipated supply and anticipated demand, right, which typically drive the way that these kind of forward-looking markets work. And then, sort of also kind of beliefs about what the market is likely to do. So it's not just, an issue of how is this going to affect oil inventories 6 months from now, and therefore how are we going to, figure out what the optimal price of oil should be, right? What the right price should be right now, given where we expect the market to be 6 months from now. The market also operates according to a logic, which is that if we expect other people to be doing this, even if we don't expect that this outcome is likely to occur, we may be wise to hedge because we expect that the market is going to inflate prices in a particular direction or deflate prices in a particular direction in response to one of these kinds of episodes.
Well, going back to the structure of the explainer that you wrote, you had three mechanisms that underlied the lack of changes to the oil markets. You talked a little bit already about the increases in oil exports coming from the Western Hemisphere. Why don't we go back to that point and you can fill me in on what's been going on with that region for the last, say, 25 years or so.
We can start this story for kind of present purposes in the year 2000. In the year 2000, if you're thinking about kind of the aggregate regional level, all of the exported oil in the world that was meeting demand from net import-dependent countries was coming from Africa, about maybe a little less than 20% of it, about 65% of it coming from the Middle East, and about 15% coming from the former Soviet Union. In the mid-2000s, you get the U.S. shale revolution. And about a decade later, basically starting in 2019, the Western Hemisphere, not just the United States, but also Canada, Brazil, Guyana, Colombia, a bunch of countries in the Western Hemisphere export oil. But the U.S., the change in U.S. contribution to the market is the most significant change. In about 2019, the Western Hemisphere as a world region actually starts becoming a net exporter of oil. And it gets to the point whereby, 2024, so last year, the Western Hemisphere is now accounting for almost 18% of global oil exports. Almost 17% of global exports.
I noticed that one country that you did not mention just now, but you had talked about before we started recording, was Venezuela. Venezuela, of course, has tons of oil, so I'm curious how it fits into the puzzle here.
We typically use kind of saying a country is the Saudi Arabia of X as a shorthand because of the historic relationship between Saudi Arabia and oil markets. Venezuela is now actually the Saudi Arabia of oil in the sense that it has this incredibly massive offshore deposit in what's known as the Orinoco Belt, which is the largest kind of national oil reserve that is found anywhere in the world at this point. Currently, most Venezuelan crude is not being traded on the kind of markets where you see that are informed by the prices that you see in major exchanges and whatnot. Most Venezuelan oil at present is being traded on the gray or black market because of Western sanctions against the Maduro regime there. So they've been kind of taken offline, which is interesting because if you feed just that little data point, right, the fact that the country with the largest proven reserves of oil in the world has effectively been shunned by the global economy, that's another one of those contextual factors that would lead you to believe that strikes on Iran would be completely destabilizing to oil markets, but that hasn't occurred.
And I think that takes us to the second mechanism from the explainer, which is this separate market, the two markets that exist in the world for oil, what you might think of as a regular market, and then an alternative one, which you could describe as a gray market or a black market. So why don't you tell me what's going on with that, where this gray market or black market oil is going, and how that fits into the lack of a shock from Iran?
Presently, Iran, the Russian Federation, and Venezuela, these are countries that control about a third of global proven oil reserves, all right, so incredibly consequential for global oil markets, are all under significant Western sanctions. And, you would think in kind of the first instance that in a global market, right, taking the production of countries representing a third of the total potential market share, right, taking them offline would be inflationary with respect to prices because they would just be essentially disappearing. That's not what's happening to that oil, though. It's not the case that Iran and Russia and Venezuela are no longer exporting oil. In fact, what they're doing now is that they're primarily serving a kind of a secondary or a bifurcated market, which is defined by kind of illiberal regimes that are not participating in these Western-led programs of sanctions against these three major oil exporters. And because they're not participating in them, they're free to purchase this production. And chief amongst those would be China. If we think about it again in historical perspective, wind the clock back to the 1970s and the period of the first kind of major Middle East oil shocks, China is consuming a trivial amount of oil by global standards. You fast forward to the 21st century, and China's meteoric rise means that it is a huge player in global oil markets, in part because it has essentially no domestic oil resources of its own. And so the net effect of some of these sanctions has been to bifurcate the oil market, as you were alluding to, between kind of the general market, which is priced according to standard benchmarks like West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude and whatnot, that is servicing most of the global economy. And then you have these, for lack of a better term, kind of pariah oil exporters that are under sanctions that are serving another segment of the market. And China is the biggest part of that story. About 90% of Iranian exports are going to China at present.
Why don't we walk down the line of reasoning of what would happen if Iran did somehow lose access to foreign markets? Is it the case, for example, that China is satiated by Iranian oil supplemented with Russian and Venezuelan oil, and is currently, because it's paying below market prices, is willing to import at those below market prices? And thus, if Iran were to be cut off from the market, that China does not start seeking Western oil? Or is that completely off the mark? Does China need a lot of this oil coming in? And thus, if Iran somehow does get shut off of the market, that China is going to then cause a spike in Western markets because of China's sudden and surging demand in those Western markets?
Yeah, I think the way I framed it in the piece is that sort of every barrel of oil that is imported from Iran or imported from Venezuela is a barrel that China does not have to source from, say, the Brent market or the West Texas Intermediate market. So if you were to actually get some sort of an attack, say a coordinated attack on export terminals, or bombing of kind of oil fields, that any of these kinds of activities, direct attacks on tankers, which we saw were a very common feature of the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, any of those would create an actual constriction in the available supply of oil that China would then have to meet in the short to medium term by sourcing from global markets. So under those circumstances, yes, you would have kind of the first order effect of just a constriction of supply, right, in the form of a major exporter going offline. And then the secondary one would be that this would send China scrambling into, kind of the spot market, but also futures markets in order to secure contracts to make sure that they have available supply 3 months or 6 months from now. Yeah, so you would definitely get that kind of dynamic if China were still kind of did not have access to some of these, sort of gray market discounted barrels of oil that they're able to source from Iran, from Venezuela, and from Russia.
In some ways, that just makes me a little bit more puzzled, because if China is going to be interested in the spot markets and the Western markets, if Iranian production suddenly disappears, then that would be perhaps an argument for why maybe there should have been more of a change to prices after the attacks. So clearly something else has to be going on here. It can't just be that there's somewhat of a buffer between the secondary market or the black or gray market and the Western market. And the third mechanism that you had in the explainer was describing Iran's perspective on this, because unless the United States is taking some sort of active efforts to stop Iranian supply from the oil markets, which is something that the United States has been loath to do, including with Russia during the Russia-Ukraine war, unless the United States was going to do something along those lines, it would have to be Iran that's making the decision to cut off the supply. What's going on inside of Iran's head? What has Iran learned about the benefits associated with doing this over time, which may help explain what's going on here?
Sure. So, I think that the knee-jerk reaction from a lot of observers and analysts was that Iran is going to close the Strait of Hormuz, right? This is this incredibly narrow kind of pathway in the global economy through which something like 40% of global oil production historically has traveled. And Iran has the ability, at least in the first instance, to interdict, to cut off access to the Strait of Hormuz. And that would send oil prices, kind of skyrocketing. And this is kind of what people think of when they think of the ability of oil exporting countries to use their oil exports and active denial of their oil exports as a means of kind of wielding political influence, right? So this is a means of creating leverage. What has happened actually, beginning in the 1980s, I think, in earnest, is that the Iranian regime has learned a pretty difficult lesson, which is that yes, it does have the ability in the abstract to manipulate oil markets in this respect, but it can't do so without also cutting off what has become essentially its only economic lifeline, which are its oil exports primarily to the People's Republic of China. And so the way that I phrase this in the piece is just to say that the lesson has been learned, and not just by Iran, but by other oil exporting countries, that if you interrupt supply, if you mess with global markets in order to make some political point or to gain leverage, in the shorter term, yes, you might achieve some of your objectives. In the longer term, you're just going to encourage more exploration effort elsewhere, and you're going to encourage faster, green energy transitions, especially by deeply oil import dependent world regions and countries like China, in order to indemnify themselves from this source of risk. So if you look at this from the perspective of 2025, we've got an Iran that's very isolated, that does not have air superiority over its own territory, that has its strategic rival that is on the offensive, has been very successful in significantly degrading Hezbollah, has been significantly successful in significantly degrading Hamas, and it now at this point has also been successful in significantly degrading Iran. They realized that, yes, they could cause chaos for Israel and for the United States by causing prices to spike. But in order to do that, they would have to cut off their economic lifeline to China because there's no other alternative route for them to export that oil. They can't ship it over land. I mean, I guess in theory, you could truck it or pipeline it, but those pipelines aren't going to be built tomorrow. And if you've looked at a map recently, they would have to traverse some of the most mountainous terrain over thousands of miles that you will find anywhere in the world, right? So they've put themselves in this position where this ostensible oil weapon that they have is actually something that they cannot use because it would require them essentially to kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
Let me see if I can provide a broad narrative of what has gone on, especially in light of what you just described with the Strait of Hormuz, which is somewhat of a nuclear option for Iran, ironically, given that this is nuclear politics and the development potentially of an Iranian nuclear weapon. But it is a nuclear option in the sense that if you do it, there's very little going back, and it's going to be costly to Iran to go down that process to begin with, to walk down that line. Well, is it the case, or could it be the case, that what we observed here is that the oil markets are understanding that it is going to be a really big deal if Iran does this? From Iran's own perspective, it will be very costly for Iran to do it. And the only way that Iran gets to that point is that Iran is put into a corner. The United States is aware of this. The U.S. government is aware of this. And so the U.S. government, combined with Israel, ends up taking steps that go down a certain escalation trajectory, but don't go so far that it's going to trigger a shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. And so if you're the oil markets and you're trying to price this all in, you understand that the likelihood of this is actually relatively low, despite the fact there are active hostilities between the two parties. Is that a plausible interpretation of what we observed?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, another way of putting it would be that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz would be akin to a kamikaze strike, right? You're going to inflict some damage, but it will come at the cost of your own life. And so, yes, is that conceivably a response that the Iranian regime might make? I would say yes, but only under the circumstances in which the likely alternative is eradication or a decapitation strike, etc. It is about the existential security of the Iranian regime at that point. Attacking the nuclear program, right, could put you on a path to getting there, but it requires a couple of kind of leaps of logic, and it requires a couple of things to come to pass in the real world that would have to be the case for that to be a rational kind of decision on their part, right? You would have to think that a large section of the Iranian people, or more likely, right, the Iranian Republican Guard, believed that these attacks on the nuclear infrastructure, the nuclear program of Iran, were an existential threat to Iran's existence. And evidently, they are not. Because if they were, then we probably would have seen a much more escalatory response strategy on their part. The problem is that if you escalate to the point of interdicting the Strait of Hormuz and trying to really mess with global crude markets, yes, you are imposing harm on kind of your enemy, in this case the United States, but you're also imposing really significant harm, and actually larger proportional harm, on your major patron, which would be China for these purposes, right? So that's actually another interesting way of thinking about this. An oil price shock in the United States, an increase in oil prices, is no longer kind of a net negative for the U.S. economy. It actually is going to, at least in the short term, just have distributive effects, because there are going to be exporters who are going to be taking advantage of that increased price and that higher price environment to generate more profits, and they're going to come at higher energy costs for the rest of us. Now, in a net oil importing country, right, the net of that change in prices is going to be uniformly negative from the perspective of the country, right, and what it wants to see happening in the global economy. If you have a country that's a net exporter of oil, yes, it might harm you and me when we go to fill up our internal combustion engine-driven vehicles, but it's going to be helpful, say, for the economy of West Texas or the economy of the Dakotas or other places where shale production is occurring. And so this is something I didn't get into the piece because I'm not as smart as you. So I'm not thinking in the three-dimensional kind of chess aspect of it. But another way of talking about this would be to think about how the United States changed from being a net oil importer to being a net oil exporter, changes the strategic calculus with respect to its activities in the Middle East, and in particular, whether or not they're willing to risk higher prices, because higher prices are something that's ostensibly good for a significant sector of the U.S. economy at this point, whereas in the 1980s or the 1970s, when the U.S. was highly import dependent, it was just pure disutility. Like the oil price shock is just going to translate into a recession, slower economic contraction, job losses, etc. Now, the effect of a relative price change is a little bit murkier than it would have been 2 or 3 decades ago.
I just want to point out that in the chain of intelligence here, you're the one who wrote me a letter of recommendation for grad school, not vice versa.
Well, evidently that investment of time and energy has paid off.
Or has distracted you from your actual work because you're recording a podcast currently with me.
You know what? The fun thing about not being an academic anymore is that this is, in fact, work for me at this point.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you for your time, Cullen.
It has been an absolute pleasure. I'm available anytime. I love speaking with you, and I'm incredibly proud of what you've done and this enormous digital footprint you've created. You are doing more to educate, I think, the world about strategic interaction via YouTube than you potentially were doing in the classroom or are doing in the classroom. So thank you very much for that.
Well, that is incredibly generous. Thank you for those comments. And for those of you who are listening, if you enjoyed this interview, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.